And joining us now in studio, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN chief medical correspondent, author of a new novel called Monday Mornings. Hello, welcome back to Canada.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into our discussion, you wear many hats, and I just want to give the audience a sense of what a week in the life of Dr. Sanjay Gupta is like. So give me a sense of that.
Well, you know, it's divided, generally speaking, between medicine and media. So about half my time now I spent doing medicine as a doctor, a neurosurgeon, and about half doing other things in the media world or writing or doing whatever. So every Monday, for example, I operate. Every other Friday, and I typically see patients in the office on Thursdays. So about two and a half day a week sort of practice. And then, you know, I have the rest of my time is really compartmentalized, you know, working on documentaries, working on shows for CNN. I do stuff for 60 Minutes. But I love writing. Writing was always something that I enjoyed, so I've just found different vehicles for it now.
And you have 3 young children as well.
I have 3 young children, yes.
And I read somewhere that you're training for is it a marathon you're training for?
Triathlon.
Triathlon, because you have all the time in the world to do that.
Well, you know, but for me, it's a totally different thing because I've done triathlons in the past, and what I realized, and this is just knowing myself, is that if I simply say, okay, I also have to exercise as part of my schedule, it's probably not going to happen. I need a goal, and I need to tell everyone about this goal. So I've told everyone I'm doing this Malibu triathlon, so now they're holding me accountable, and it forces me to not let my exercise fall off the map.
Do you ever get confused when you're in the OR, think you might have to grab a microphone and do a stand-up or anything?
I don't, luckily haven't had that confusion, but I do wake up a lot of times and I have no idea where I am. I mean, this morning I think I woke up thinking, well, you know, good couple minutes before I figure out what city it is.
Probably better to have that confusion when you're on the journalist side of things rather than in the OR.
Exactly.
Your new book, it's a novel. It's called Monday Mornings. And in both your professional lives, being a doctor and a journalist, you're really dealing with the facts and reality. So why the slide into fiction?
Well, you know, the content was really what drove it. I didn't even necessarily set out to write a book, and certainly not a fiction book. First I thought when I was thinking about that it could be a book was nonfiction. I was thinking I wanted to show people this part of medicine that very few people get to see and even fewer get to experience. And it's these sort of secret gatherings that take place in hospitals among doctors where they openly discuss their mistakes. And they close the door. And they're very candid with one another. They say, you know, they might say, Piya, you know, you messed this up. You made a mistake. And here's how not to let that happen again. And by the way, for anyone else listening and who's in that room, here's how you never make this mistake. And I always found these meetings to be one of the most indelible, you know, parts of my medical training and my medical life. So, you know, I thought maybe, you know, it'd be an interesting thing to write about and maybe do it in a nonfiction way. But then I realized it wasn't about implicating hospitals or implicating doctors. If I wanted to have a little bit more liberty and freedom, fiction might be a better way to do it.
But are they based on real-life circumstance that you have seen in the various medical hospitals that you practice in?
To some extent. I mean, the meetings that I describe are real. Those meetings do happen in most hospitals, you know, around the world. The stories themselves are kernels of ideas that I subsequently turned into actual stories. The characters are composites of people I've met throughout my life. So it really is fiction in that sense. But I think a lot of people who've worked in hospitals or ever attended a meeting like this will be nodding their heads saying, I've seen this sort of thing myself.
Well, I want to pick up on that because I'm wondering, as a journalist and in the media, we often get criticized for not maybe portraying the facts as precisely as some of our audience might criticize us for. And I'm wondering, did you feel this need to paint a more accurate picture of what goes on in your other world, which is in the OR?
You know, it really wasn't that for me. There was no sort of compulsion to say, look, you know, I need to really paint this picture, specific picture of my medical life. That wasn't it. I think for me it was really more this idea that in our lives, not just in medicine, but you know, people all make mistakes. The real question is, what do you do after a mistake occurs? What kind of person are you? Do you deny it? Do you sweep it under the rug? Or do you acknowledge it, become transparent, and learn from it? And that was the theme that I really wanted to get at. And while obviously this is something that I'm familiar with in the hospital setting, I did start to wonder aloud, you know, how does society potentially, you know, learn something from these sorts of meetings? And should we have these meetings in other places? Should we have them in journalism, for example?
Should we?
Yeah, well, I think for me, they were one of the most important parts of my training. So I absolutely think that at the end of the day or end of the week or however, what the right amount of time is, you would sit with your colleagues, people who are like you, your peers, and really just be perfectly candid. Pia, you did a great job on this, but here's where you could have done better on this. And it's not punitive.
It's usually more brutal than that.
Yeah, but it's not meant, no one's worried about losing their job. It's not a punitive thing. You're not worried about being sued. It's just the spirit of making each other better. So I really think these types of meetings could be in lots of places in our society.
I think one of the fascinating things about wearing both hats, if you will, is that, you've been to many parts of the world. You've been to war zones, into natural disasters to cover them as a journalist. And yet you can't subtract the doctor in you from that. So when I go off to cover these, I don't want to say I'm a dispassionate, I don't care about what's going on the ground, but I know that my job there is to report what I'm seeing. And although I always have the urge to help, you have the expertise to actually help. So how do you sort of balance that pull to be a journalist with the one that says, hey, I'm a doctor, I could help that injured child right there?
It's funny because for me, that was, excuse the pun, but it was a no-brainer. I mean, you help the child. How is that even a question in today's day and age? Do you sit there and report with the microphone, or do you help a child who's in need? I was struck by the fact that that question was even being asked. Now, I will say this, that to the extent that you want to remain an objective journalist, if you're working shoulder to shoulder with the very people that you're reporting on, sure, that's a legitimate discussion to have. But putting on a press badge should never be a bar to your humanity, and regardless of whether you're a doctor.
Sometimes you've got a deadline to meet for your journalistic thing, and you've got to go, and you've got to leave some of those injured people behind. How do you balance that in your own head? Because I mean, you've said the Hippocratic Oath, you've signed up for that. So how do you sort of live with that, I guess?
Well, I mean, that sort of exact situation came up for us in Haiti. I mean, I was actually at a tent full of injured people who had just had some major surgery. They were in this desert tent, or this sort of urban tent, and the doctors who were there suddenly left because there was some concerns about violence in the area, and they essentially withdrew, leaving all the patients there, no supplies, nothing. And I was reporting at that point, and I had deadlines and stuff which frankly mattered very little to me, and I just stayed and took care of the patients. And I've done that in situations.
What do you tell your boss at the CNN? Say, I'm staying?
Yeah, I did.
And they were okay with that?
They were okay with that. I think my bosses, typically, it's hard to paint the executive floor of any company with one brush, but I think they get that as well. I mean, I think that they understand in a situation like that. I mean, we couldn't have left. We could not have left those patients. They would have died. So the deadline issue, it wasn't as big an issue, I think, as it was this idea, can you remain objective in those situations? And, look, I think, common sense prevails here. I have had lots of worthy discussions with people who walk the hallowed halls of journalism about this, and I agree with them that you want to remain objective. But I was asked to operate in Iraq. I was asked to operate in Afghanistan. I was asked to take care of people in Haiti. I'm not jumping in there. 99% of the time that I was helping, there were no cameras around. I was doing this on my own time. But every now and then it would get caught on camera, and it was all of a sudden, is he the reporter or is he the doctor?
He's becoming part of the story.
Right. Is he becoming part of the story? And that's a fine discussion to have. But I think that the people who potentially would be harmed if you didn't help, I think would have a very specific viewpoint on this. And by the way, P, I should tell you, it's not just doctors. If you were a person on the ground in Haiti like we were 12 hours after the earthquake, long before a lot of relief organizations get there, you could help, not necessarily like administering medicine or administering, your medical skills, but just being a person helping people who are trapped or who don't have access to any kind of help. My guess is you probably want to do that.
I've done it.
You've done it.
Yeah.
And I think you don't just pick up the microphone and say, that guy is in really bad shape there. Yeah. Put the microphone down and help him out. The story can wait. You can still tell the story.
You were in Japan last year after the tsunami and the earthquake there. How is medical reporting different in a natural disaster scenario, reality, I shouldn't say scenario, versus in a war zone?
Well, from an emotional standpoint, I think in a natural disaster, there is, as tragic as it is, there isn't this constant sort of threat necessarily that someone's going to come in and try and kill you. In a war zone, you're always sort of, you're in a war, and there's this concern that people are trying to shoot at you and kill you. So that I think from just an emotional standpoint, a safety standpoint, is a little different. Japan was unique in that, in the midst of our reporting there, the details about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant became more clear. and the fact that there was radiation and in the air was real. So that was different than any story I'd ever covered because it was invisible. You couldn't feel it. A lot of people were very worried. We had these detectors, and we stayed up late at night watching, is it going to alarm on us? So that was different for that reason. But they're both similar in that the health stories, I feel, become some of the biggest stories. People don't always understand what the war is about. They don't even understand what a tsunami really is. But you see people in the hospital who need medical care, and all of a sudden you feel closer, you feel more engaged as a global citizen.
I want to ask you about health reporting because, of course, that makes up so much of the modern media landscape. And it's not just in war zones or natural disasters. We see health stories every day on the front page of our newspaper. And so you have the expertise from the medical side to be a medical reporter. A lot of journalists don't. They're general assignment reporters who have to go do a story on, Herceptin or something like that. Do you think the lack of expertise in a medical way hinders a journalist, or is it just okay, like we cover lots of other stories?
Well, I think you don't need to be a doctor to be a very good health reporter. I mean, I think some of the best health reporters I've had the privilege of working with have not been doctors, but they've been very, very good at what they do, and they develop a niche area. So it's not so much that they had a separate job or training that made them experts. They became experts on their own. And I think that that's probably, going to become a neurosurgeon, training for 7 years and running a practice, that's probably not the ideal way to become a health reporter. But I think whatever area you choose to cover, I think probably having some niche is probably a good thing. Even if you're a general assignment reporter, having something that you sort of call your own. And we're going to call Piya on this one. She's the go-to person on this, I think, is good.
But I guess the pressures of, especially daily journalism, health stories are often based on big research papers. There's a lot to go through, and yet there's this pressure to get that story on air or for the newspaper the next day. Is that a fair thing for journalists to do, to quickly turn around these very dense stories where, you might have some broad knowledge of a certain health issue, but medicine's really based on detail, and there's been a lot of criticism about the kind of medical coverage we're seeing in the media.
Yeah, I think, and some of that is probably warranted. I think we do try and turn around some of these pretty sophisticated topics quickly. I think I may have a little bit of an advantage there because I'm a doctor. I'm used to reading scientific studies, but I'm not sure it's that much of an advantage. I still have to read it like everybody else does. I mean, the one thing you'd ask yourself is, with some of these things that are important, like the Herceptin story, because you have embargoes. So a reporter like you or me can be given the study ahead of time, and then if we all remain true to the embargo, not break the embargo till 4 o'clock 2 days later, it gives you the time to actually dig in, produce a good story, and have it ready to go. Doesn't always happen, though. You're right.
One of the other criticisms that's launched at health and scientific reporting is not only the lack of expertise, but it's also so there's a general way stories are told. And if you look at something like foreign affairs, for example, also takes expertise stuff. But it seems to me that health reporting kind of gets a bit more flack for regular journalists doing it. Why do you think that is, and is it warranted?
I don't know that it does. I mean, maybe you have specific examples of how it gets more flack. I think political reporting, because of its ideological undertones and that sort of thing, or even foreign affairs reporting because of the question of what is the United States or Canada's interest in a particular country, that becomes more of an ideological issue. I think with health reporting, the critical element is your credibility. I think if you get it wrong, then absolutely the flack is warranted, and frankly it could be potentially dangerous because health reporting is different that way. But I think there's a huge appetite for this content. People have a hard time getting in to see their doctors. They have a hard time finding credible content anymore, anywhere. We're not sure what to trust. So if you have a few good trusted sources like you or me or whoever it may be in a particular area, you just got to make sure you're doing it well.
What about the Dr. Oz's and the doctors? I mean, people are sort of lopping those kinds of media personalities in with people like yourself, trained as a medical doctor.
Right. And look, I mean, those guys are all people I know well, and they're good friends of mine. I think like Dr. Oz, I think provides a very valuable service. I mean, I think he is the health illiteracy rate in the United States is around 90%. I was struck by that. About 90%.
What do you mean by health illiteracy?
Well, you know, there's a series of questions trying to figure out how health literate are people. Do they understand what antibiotics are used for? Do they understand what hypertension is? Do they understand, you know, just these types of questions? And at the end of it, they said the health illiteracy rate is about 9 out of every 10 people. So when you see a show like The Doctors, I think it's educating people in a way that's, you know, I think helpful. And a lot of people watch those shows. I do something different. You know, I'm a news guy, so I'm really focusing on what's happening in the news in the world of medicine. So it's yeah, we're both doctors, we both do television, but I think we have slightly different mandates and tasks.
I want to throw a little bit of more criticism your way. This is actually comes from one of the Columbia Journalism Review back in 2007 from the former president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, a woman by the name of Trudy Lieberman. Here's what she had to say about the state of medical journalism. She says, "It's the product of a marriage of the hospital's desperate need to compete for lucrative lines of business in our current health system and of TV's hunger for cheap and easy stories. In some cases, the hospitals pay for airtime, a sponsorship, and in others, they don't, but still provide expertise and story ideas. Either way, the result is that too often the hospitals control the story. Viewers who think they are getting news are really getting a form of advertising. And critical stories, hospital infection rates, for example, or medical mistakes or poor care, tend not to be covered in such a cozy atmosphere." Do you agree with that?
I mean, the last part is obviously not true. I mean, medical mistakes aren't covered. I mean, they're headlines. You know, it's if a guy operates on the wrong side of the brain, as happened at Mount Sinai in New York, that was a major story for a long time. I think with regard to reporters taking shortcuts and being handed a press release from a hospital or some sort of essentially what is no more than a PSA and essentially running with that as a news story or using video from a hospital, yeah, that probably happens. You know, I'm fortunate, and I'm cautious in saying this, but I'm fortunate I work for a big news organization where we don't have to take those shortcuts. You know, we have 24 producers. Some of my producers have been doing this for 20 years.
You have 24 producers on your show?
24 producers. Well, for the medical unit,
right.
You know, so we're
wow.
an international news organization that covers, you know, several different networks and a digital platform in CNN.com. So there's a huge appetite. But I imagine if someone doesn't have the resources to cover health stories and they're simply handed a story, you know, by fill in the blank, whichever hospital Trudy was talking about, I'm not even sure. If people have run with that without being more critical, then that's a problem. She's right there. But you know, the problem with writing stuff like that is, you know, you need to give specific examples as well. I just think tossing generalizations and saying, you know, health and media, you know, is problematic because hospitals want their stories to get on TV. Of course they do. So do companies. So do banks. You know, so do mortgage companies. You know, everybody does. So I don't know that you can individualize that to the health specific reporting.
Do you think medical journalism, though, needs to improve in any way?
I think we need more resources. I think in an era where resources are being cut in a lot of places, and again, I say I'm fortunate because, you know, CNN has made a huge investment in health reporting. I mean, you know, we do documentaries, we do day of air reporting, we service the web, we service several different networks around the world. But I also know that most networks don't have that luxury. Health reporting, I think, is different because people make decisions based on what they see. Sometimes they're big decisions, sometimes they're small decisions, but they're important decisions. So if you're gonna be in this area, you have to do it right and make sure there's enough resources.
Let me ask you a specific example. If you were presented with a cancer study that we're not going to know the results for years, and you've got to report on this, as a doctor, how do you approach that?
What do you mean you have to report on it?
Well, it's a story. It's making news. They want to see a story, but we don't know what the results are going to be for a year. Do you say, you know what, this isn't? We're not going to report on this?
Well, I mean, look, this whole notion that reporters have no editorial control, I think, is that's I think a little bit exaggerated. I would like to think, and I know it's true for me, that you say, look, there's no story here. We're in phase 2 of phase 3 trials. You know, it's not there yet. It's an animal study. We don't know yet. It's an early stem cell study. I think if you're going to report on it, if for some reason you do decide to report on it, you have to be just very transparent about that. We don't know what the final outcome of this is. Here's what researchers are trying to prove, but they haven't been able to prove it yet. Here's what researchers have tried to prove in this area in the past. Didn't work. You know, so I think you can have sins of omission if you don't report those stories with, you know, the full context. The thing that drives me the most crazy is when you talk about risk and people say, well, this medication will double your risk of having a heart attack. That's the headline. No one challenges it, no one goes any further. But if I add this sentence, it's 1 in a million without the medication and 2 in a million with the medication. That's doubling your risk. That's a much different story all of a sudden. And I think, simple things of understanding epidemiology, understanding absolute versus relative risk, these things don't mean things in terms of the science to the viewer, but they need to know the complete story. And that's an example.
You must get frustrated reading the daily papers and watching a lot of the news coverage of health stories from your doctor's perspective anyway.
Some do it better than others, I mean, there are some very good health reporters out there, and some of the newspaper reporters, I think in part because they get more space, more words to actually be able to tell a story, can dive into these very important details.
Okay, you've written a novel, you're going to run a triathlon, and before I let you go, I have to ask, you were asked to be Surgeon General before. Right. You said too busy, got better things to do. If you're asked again?
Well, the Surgeon General thing was there was a great irony in being asked that. I was asked when I was 39 years old. And you can't.
That old, huh?
Yeah. Well, no. The point is that they're much older typically.
No, 39 is pretty good to be asked to be Surgeon General.
Well, you can't. I was told I couldn't practice surgery anymore as Surgeon General. If you go away from neurosurgery for 4 years, or 8 years, depending on what happens with this election, you're probably not going back to that field. So I'd have been 43 years old with the inability to continue to be, a neurosurgeon, or I would have had to retrain. It just wasn't the right time for me. But I've worked at the White House before. I've worked in public service. I could easily see myself going back into that area at some point.
So maybe when you're 50, 55, and they ask you.
I'm not sure what the right age is. But
good luck with your triathlon. Thanks for coming in. It was lovely to meet you.
Appreciate it. You too. Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.